The German soldiers manning the coastal defense position at Maløy, Norway, on December 27, 1941, heard something that made absolutely no sense. Through the icy fog rolling off the Norwegian sea, cutting through the distant rumble of naval gunfire and the drone of aircraft engines, came a sound that hadn't been heard on a European battlefield in over 300 years, the haunting melody of Scottish bagpipes. Unteroffizier Klaus Weber squinted through the morning mist, his Mauser K98K rifle trained toward the beach where British commandos were storming ashore. But what he saw next would haunt him for the rest of his life. Leading the charge, standing fully upright while bullets churned the frozen sand around him, was a tall figure in a dark green commando uniform, bagpipes slung across his chest, playing The March of the Cameron Men at full volume. And strapped across his back, glinting in the pale Arctic dawn, was a Scottish broadsword. Klaus fired 3 shots at the impossible figure. All missed. The piper never broke stride, never stopped playing, never sought cover. Behind him, 52 British commandos of No. 3 Commando rushed forward, their battle cry mixing with the wild skirl of the pipes. Klaus would survive that morning, barely. But he would spend the rest of his life telling a story that nobody quite believed, the story of the last man to charge into battle with a medieval sword and live. This is the story of Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, British Army commando known to history as Mad Jack, a man who proved that sometimes the most advanced weapon is the one nobody expects, a warrior who believed that any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed, and a soldier whose philosophy of warfare was so unorthodox, so seemingly suicidal, that it somehow worked brilliantly against the most mechanized modern army the world had ever seen. Before we dive into the most extraordinary military career of World War II, we want to know, where are you watching from? Are you from Britain, India, Pakistan, the United States, or somewhere else? Drop your country in the comments. If you want more incredible true war stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. A like helps these forgotten heroes reach more people who need to hear their stories. Now, let's return to December 27, 1941, and the moment history's last knight went to war. The making of a madman. John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill was born on September 16, 1906, in Colombo, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, where his father worked as a civil engineer for the British colonial government. From his earliest days, Jack, as everyone called him, showed signs of being spectacularly unsuited for normal life. While other children played cricket and learned proper Victorian manners, young Jack was climbing trees to outrageous heights, swimming in monsoon-swollen rivers, and generally terrifying every adult within supervision distance. His family returned to England when Jack was young, settling in Hong Kong briefly before his education began in earnest. He attended King William's College on the Isle of Man, where he developed 3 lifelong passions that would define his character: archery, motorcycle racing, and playing the bagpipes. The combination was, even then, eccentric. Archery in the 1920s was considered a quaint medieval throwback, motorcycle racing was for daredevils and lunatics, and bagpipes were tolerated in Scotland but considered noise pollution everywhere else. Jack didn't care. He practiced archery with the obsession of a medieval archer training for war, spending hours daily until he could hit a playing card at 50 yards. He learned bagpipes with similar dedication, his neighbors filing multiple noise complaints. And he rode motorcycles with such reckless abandon that he accumulated an impressive collection of broken bones before age 20. In 1926, at age 20, Jack graduated from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, entering the British Army as a second lieutenant in the Manchester Regiment. He was posted to Burma, where the peacetime military routine of the late British Empire bored him nearly to death. Garrison duty meant paperwork, inspections, formal dinners, and endless colonial ceremonies. Jack wanted adventure, not bureaucracy. So he found adventure elsewhere. During his Burma posting, Jack became one of the finest shots with a longbow in the British Empire, representing Britain in the World Archery Championship in 1939. He also learned to play the bagpipes at competition level, performing at military events across Asia. His fellow officers considered him odd but harmless, a talented eccentric who would probably retire as a forgotten lieutenant colonel somewhere in the provinces. They were spectacularly wrong. The warrior awakens. When World War II erupted in September 1939, Jack Churchill was working as a newspaper editor in Nairobi, Kenya, having left the army in 1936 out of sheer boredom. The news from Europe electrified him. Finally, real war. Not colonial police actions against poorly armed tribesmen, but total war against the modern enemy with tanks, aircraft, artillery. This was the war Jack had been unconsciously training for his entire life. He immediately contacted the War Office in London, requesting reinstatement. The British Army, desperate for experienced officers, asked no questions about his unorthodox hobbies. Jack was recommissioned as a lieutenant in the Manchester Regiment in May 1940, just as France was collapsing and Britain faced invasion. But Jack didn't want a normal infantry posting. He wanted something special, something that matched his peculiar skill set. When he heard about the formation of the Commandos, elite light infantry units trained for raiding operations behind enemy lines, Jack knew he'd found his calling. The Commandos were looking for officers who could think independently, take initiative, survive behind enemy lines, and lead small units in high-risk operations. In other words, they wanted dangerous maniacs who could function as professional soldiers. Jack was overqualified. He volunteered for No. 3 Commando in 1940 and immediately impressed his superiors with his physical fitness, marksmanship, and complete disregard for personal safety. During training exercises in Scotland, while other officers planned careful tactical approaches, Jack would simply charge directly at the objective, screaming at the top of his lungs, often succeeding through sheer audacity. It was during this training period that Jack began carrying his grandfather's Scottish broadsword, a basket-hilted claymore from the 18th century. When questioned by his commanding officer about the anachronistic weapon, Jack replied calmly, "In my opinion, sir, any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." The commanding officer, Colonel John Durnford Slater, stared at the medieval weapon for a long moment, then at Jack's absolutely serious expression, then back at the sword. Finally, he shrugged. "Very well, Churchill. Carry your damned sword. Just don't cut off any of our own men's heads." Jack saluted smartly. "I shall endeavor to aim exclusively at Germans, sir." It was the beginning of the most unconventional combat career in modern military history. The First Blood. Jack Churchill's first combat action came in December 1941 in the raid on Vauxhall, Norway. The mission was part of a larger British strategy to harass German occupation forces, destroy strategic installations, and tie down enemy troops that might otherwise be sent to Russia, where the Wehrmacht was locked in desperate winter combat. The target was the small Norwegian island of Malio and the nearby town of South Mogsoy, where the Germans had established a fish oil processing plant producing glycerin for explosives, a garrison of approximately 150 troops, and coastal defense batteries. British intelligence estimated moderate resistance. They were wrong, but not in the way they expected. The assault force consisted of 51 officers and 525 men from No. 3 Commando and No. 4 Commando, plus 2 companies of Norwegian troops eager to strike back at the occupiers of their homeland. Supporting them was a naval task force including the cruiser HMS Kenya, 4 destroyers, and a submarine. The plan called for a pre-dawn assault following naval bombardment, with commandos landing directly on the beaches to neutralize German positions before they could organize resistance. Jack Churchill commanded a unit within No. 3 Commando. As the landing craft approached the fog-shrouded beach in the pre-dawn darkness of December 27th, his men could hear the naval guns pounding German positions, see the flash of explosions lighting the fog. They expected to land under heavy fire, fighting their way off the beach against machine gun positions and fortified bunkers. What they didn't expect was their commanding officer standing up in the landing craft, bagpipes in hand as they approached the beach. "Churchill, what the hell are you doing?" shouted Captain John Giles over the roar of engines and explosions. "Get down before you're shot!" Jack ignored him, planting his feet firmly in the landing craft, and began playing The March of the Cameron Men, a traditional Scottish battle tune that hadn't been heard in actual combat since Culloden in 1746. The Commandos stared at him in disbelief, mixed with reluctant admiration. Their officer was either completely insane or possessed of courage so absolute it transcended sanity. The landing craft hit the beach, the ramp dropped, and Jack Churchill, still playing the bagpipes, walked calmly off the boat and onto the Norwegian sand, directly into German machine gun fire. The impossible charge. What happened next became legend in British commando circles, though official reports carefully omitted the more unbelievable details. Jack walked 20 yards up the beach, bullets kicking up sand around his feet, the sound of bagpipes mixing with machine gun fire and explosions. Then he stopped playing, slung the bagpipes across his back, and drew his broadsword from his sheath with his right hand, and drew his longbow with his left hand, an arrow already nocked. Behind him, his men were charging forward, some seeking cover, some running directly at German positions, all of them wondering if their commanding officer had gone completely mad under fire. Jack spotted a German soldier in a bunker, approximately 50 yards distant, the soldier's helmet visible above sandbags, his machine gun spitting fire at the commandos on the beach. Jack raised his longbow, drew the arrow back to his ear, held his breath despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins, and released. The arrow flew in a perfect arc, covering 50 yards in less than 2 seconds, and struck the German soldier in the neck. The machine gun went silent. The German collapsed behind the sandbags, an arrow through his throat, killed by a weapon that hadn't been used in European warfare since the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Jack knocked another arrow and kept moving forward, his broadsword gleaming in his other hand. His men, emboldened by his apparent invincibility, charged forward with renewed courage. If their commander could walk through machine gun fire with a sword and bow, then surely they could manage with modern rifles. The battle for Malloy lasted approximately 4 hours. German forces, recovering from the initial shock of the naval bombardment and commando assault, fought back fiercely. House-to-house combat raged through South Vaxoy, with commandos clearing German positions room by room, floor by floor. The fish oil plant was demolished with explosives. German ammunition dumps were destroyed. Coastal batteries were neutralized. And through it all, Jack Churchill fought with sword and bow, leading from the front, seemingly immune to bullets. Later accounts from his men describe him capturing a German garrison of 4 soldiers by appearing suddenly around a corner, broadsword pointed at them, bellowing in German, "Surrender or die." The Germans, confronted by a wild-eyed British officer with a medieval sword, chose surrender. By the time the commandos withdrew to their landing craft at mid-morning, they had suffered relatively light casualties. 17 killed, 53 wounded. German losses were approximately 120 killed, 98 captured. The raid was considered a complete success, damaging German infrastructure, capturing valuable intelligence documents, and proving that British commandos could strike anywhere along the occupied coast. But in No. 3 Commando, only one thing mattered. Mad Jack Churchill had killed a German with a bow and arrow, captured prisoners with a sword, and survived without a scratch. The legend was born. The philosophy of madness. After Malloy, Jack Churchill's reputation spread throughout the British armed forces. Senior officers didn't quite know what to make of him. His combat record was exemplary, his leadership inspired absolute loyalty from his men, and his tactical instincts were brilliant. But his methods were, by any conventional standard, completely insane. When questioned by a staff officer about his use of medieval weapons, Jack's response became famous. I maintain that, as compared to the Tommy gun, the bow and arrow combination possesses a number of distinct advantages. A longbow is silent, has a higher rate of accurate fire than a rifle in the hands of an expert, never needs reloading in the conventional sense, and requires no expensive ammunition. Furthermore, a man killed by an arrow creates far greater confusion among enemy ranks than a man killed by a bullet, as the former suggests the presence of a silent, deadly marksman capable of striking from unexpected directions. There was logic to his madness, but most officers thought the logic itself was mad. But nobody could argue with results. Jack's combat effectiveness was extraordinary. His men would follow him anywhere, which, in commando operations, was the ultimate measure of leadership. The sword, Jack argued, served a different purpose. The sword is a psychological weapon. In close-quarters combat, an enemy soldier may face a man with a rifle with some degree of composure, but faced with a man charging at him with a broadsword, screaming like a berserker, most men's training breaks down. They freeze, flee, or surrender. It's not about the physical weapon. It's about breaking the enemy's will to fight. Modern military psychologists who have studied Jack's career acknowledge he had a point. Humans have evolved responses to certain threats, and those responses are deeply hardwired. A blade is one of the oldest threats in human history, triggering primal fear responses that guns, relatively recent in evolutionary terms, don't quite match. Jack Churchill understood psychological warfare instinctively, long before it became a formal military discipline. The Raid on Bergen. Jack Churchill's next major operation came in December 1943, in a raid on German positions near Bergen, Norway. British intelligence had identified a German coastal battery that was interfering with Allied convoy operations. The battery needed to be neutralized, but it was too well defended for air attack and too far inland for naval bombardment. That left one option: Commandos. Jack, now a major, led the assault force. The plan called for a night landing, a 10-mile march through mountainous terrain in winter conditions, a surprise attack at dawn, destruction of the guns, and withdrawal before German reinforcements arrived. It was ambitious, dangerous, and exactly the kind of mission Jack loved. The landing went perfectly. The march through the Norway mountains was brutal, with temperatures well below freezing and snow making every step treacherous, but Jack's men were among the toughest in the British military. They reached their attack position 2 hours before dawn, cold, exhausted, but ready. As the first gray light touched the mountains, Jack assembled his assault team. He was carrying his broadsword, his longbow, his bagpipes, a Webley revolver, and a handful of grenades. He looked like a warrior from 3 different centuries simultaneously. "Gentlemen," he said quietly to his men, "the Germans are still sleeping. They don't expect us. We have surprise, we have the high ground, and we have the advantage of superior morale. They have machine guns, mortars, and numerical superiority. I calculate our chances of success at approximately 60%. One of his sergeants grinned. "I'll take those odds, sir." Jack smiled. "Excellent. Because I lied. Our chances are actually closer to 40%, but I didn't want to discourage anyone. Now, when we attack, I want maximum noise. Scream, yell, make them think we're a full battalion. And for God's sake, try not to shoot me in the back when I charge ahead with this sword." The men laughed quietly, their fear transforming into the strange euphoria that comes before combat. They would follow Mad Jack into hell itself. The attack began with Jack standing on a rock outcropping, fully silhouetted against the dawn sky, playing his bagpipes. The road to the Isles echoed across the Norwegian mountains, and for a few precious seconds, the German garrison froze in confusion. What was that sound? Why were bagpipes playing? Were they under attack, or was this some kind of drill? Then the Commandos charged, screaming battle cries, and the Germans realized this was very much an attack. Jack led the charge, sword drawn, running directly at a German machine gun position. The gunner swung his MG-34 around, finger tightening on the trigger, but Jack was too fast. He vaulted over the sandbag parapet with the agility of an Olympic athlete and brought his broadsword down in a powerful overhead slash. The blade bit into the machine gun's receiver, jamming the mechanism. Before the stun gunner could react, Jack had disarmed him and was using the gun as a club to clear the position. His men poured through the breach, engaging German defenders in close-quarters combat. The battle was short, brutal, and decisive. Within 30 minutes, the Commandos had captured the entire battery, along with 42 German prisoners. The guns were demolished with explosives, and the Commandos began their withdrawal, carrying their wounded and hurting prisoners ahead of them. But German reinforcements were already en route. Wehrmacht units from Bergen had been alerted and were converging on the position. Jack realized they couldn't evacuate everyone before being cut off. Somebody had to buy time. "Sergeant Morrison," Jack called to his senior NCO, "take the men and the prisoners and get to the extraction point. I'll establish a delaying position here." Morrison stared at him. "Sir, you can't hold this position alone. You'll be killed or captured." Jack grinned. "Probably captured. The Germans are quite good at taking prisoners, but I can slow them down long enough for you to escape. That's an order, Sergeant. Now move." Reluctantly, Morrison gathered the men and began the retreat. Jack watched them disappear into the mountains, then turned to face the approaching Germans. He had his sword, his bow with approximately 30 arrows, his revolver with 12 shots, and several grenades, against roughly 200 German soldiers. The odds, he decided, were terrible, which made it interesting. The Last Stand. Jack Churchill's last stand at Bergen has become one of the most debated incidents in his career, primarily because the only detailed accounts come from Jack himself, who had a well-documented tendency to embellish stories. However, German records confirm the basic facts. A British officer held a position single-handedly for approximately 2 hours, inflicting casualties and delaying a company-strength unit before being captured. Jack selected a narrow defile between two rock formations, a natural choke point where the Germans would have to approach in a narrow column. He positioned himself behind a low stone wall, giving him cover while maintaining clear sight lines down the approach path. The first German patrol appeared, about 15 minutes after his men had withdrawn. 10 soldiers advancing cautiously, weapons ready. They spotted Jack's position and took cover, unwilling to charge directly at an unknown number of defenders. For all they knew, an entire British commando unit was entrenched up there. Eventually, the German commander brought up reinforcements and mortars. Mortar shells began falling around Jack's position, forcing him deeper into cover. He switched to his revolver, picking his shots carefully, each bullet making the Germans respect his position even more. But ammunition doesn't last forever. Jack fired his last revolver round, threw his last grenade, and shot his last arrow. He was down to his sword. The Germans, realizing the firing had stopped, launched their final assault. They rushed Jack's position from 3 sides simultaneously, overwhelming him through sheer numbers. Jack met him with his broadsword, slashing and thrusting, fighting like a cornered wolf. He wounded 3 Germans before being tackled by 6 soldiers who pinned him to the ground and disarmed him. The German officer commanding the assault, Hauptmann Friedrich Müller, approached the captured commando, expecting to find a hardened warrior. Instead, he found a tall, lean British officer in his late 30s calmly dusting himself off, completely uninjured, despite having fought alone against 200 men for 2 hours. "There, Cincy," Müller asked in German. "Who are you?" Jack replied in perfect German, "Lieutenant Colonel John Churchill, British Army. I must compliment you on your persistence, Hauptmann. Your men fought well, though I would recommend more aggressive tactics in future. You could have taken this position an hour ago with a proper flanking maneuver." Müller stared at him, unsure whether to be insulted or impressed. Then he noticed the broadsword lying on the ground, its blade notched from combat. "You fought with a sword." "Among other things," Jack replied cheerfully. "I also used a bow and arrow, bagpipes, and various firearms. The sword was my last resort. It's quite effective at close range, though I admit it has limitations against mortars." Muller picked up the sword, examining it with the appreciation of a professional soldier for a fine weapon. "This is a Scottish claymore, 18th century if I'm not mistaken. My grandfather's Urukek. It's been in the family for generations. I would be most grateful if you could ensure it's properly cared for. It has sentimental value." Muller found himself smiling despite the situation. This British officer was either completely mad or possessed of courage that transcended sanity. Probably both. "I will see that it reaches a museum, Colonel Churchill, along with your bow and bagpipes. They deserve to be preserved." "You're very kind," Jack replied sincerely. Then he added, "Now, shall we discuss the terms of my captivity? I assume I'm being sent to a POW camp." "You assume correctly." "Excellent. I shall endeavor to escape at the first opportunity, of course. It's expected of British officers. But I wanted to inform you in advance, as a matter of professional courtesy." Muller laughed. He couldn't help it. "I appreciate the warning, Colonel. We shall endeavor to keep you securely imprisoned." "I'm sure you'll do your best, though I should mention I've been told I'm rather good at escaping." He wasn't exaggerating. The prisoner. Jack Churchill was transported to Sachsenhausen concentration camp near Berlin, one of the most secure POW facilities in the Third Reich. The camp held primarily political prisoners and captured resistance fighters, but a section was reserved for particularly dangerous or high-value POWs. Jack was classified as extremely dangerous, high escape risk, and placed under special security. This didn't bother Jack at all. He viewed captivity as a temporary inconvenience and an interesting challenge. How does one escape from a maximum security camp designed to hold the most resourceful prisoners in Europe? It was a puzzle, and Jack loved puzzles. He spent his first weeks carefully observing the camp routine, mapping guard positions, timing patrols, identifying vulnerabilities. He made friends with other prisoners, particularly Polish and Norwegian resistance fighters who had extensive experience with escape attempts. He exercised obsessively, maintaining his physical fitness for the eventual escape. In September 1944, approximately 10 months after his capture, Jack made his move. The details of his escape are classified in some British records, but the basic facts are known. He and a Norwegian POW named Reidar Bakke escaped through a drainage tunnel during a nighttime air raid when guards were distracted by Allied bombers overhead. They traveled by night, hiding by day, covering approximately 150 miles through German-occupied territory over the course of 2 weeks. They survived by stealing food from farms, drinking from streams, and avoiding all human contact. Jack, despite being a foreign officer in enemy territory without weapons or supplies, thrived. This was exactly the kind of adventure he dreamed of his entire life. Near the Baltic coast, they encountered a German patrol. Bakke wanted to hide, but Jack had a different idea. He calmly walked up to the German soldiers, speaking perfect German, and spun an elaborate story about being a Norwegian collaborator transporting a prisoner to Gestapo headquarters. The Germans, seeing Jack's confident demeanor and fluent German, believed him completely and even offered directions to the nearest checkpoint. Jack and Bakke eventually reached the Baltic, stole a small fishing boat, and sailed to Denmark, which was still occupied but had an active resistance network. The Danish resistance smuggled them to neutral Sweden, from where they were repatriated to Britain in October 1944. Jack Churchill had escaped from one of the most secure POW camps in the Third Reich, traveled 150 miles through enemy territory, and talked his way past German patrols. When he arrived in London, his superiors didn't know whether to court-martial him for his unorthodox methods or give him another medal. They settled for the latter, awarding him the Distinguished Service Order for his combat record and escape. Jack's first words upon returning to Britain were reportedly, "Bloody shame, the war ended before I could get back into action. I was looking forward to killing more Germans." His superiors gently reminded him that the war in Europe was still ongoing. Jack smiled. "Excellent. When do I leave?" The final campaign. In early 1945, Jack Churchill volunteered for service in Burma, where British forces were fighting the Japanese in brutal jungle warfare. He was assigned to command a unit in the Burma campaign, leading patrols deep into Japanese-held territory. But by this time, the war was winding down. Jack participated in several operations, but he never encountered the kind of close-quarters combat he preferred. No sword charges, no bagpipe assaults, no dramatic last stands. Just careful, professional military operations designed to minimize casualties and maximize efficiency. Jack found it boring. When victory in Europe was declared in May 1945, Jack was disappointed. When Japan surrendered in August after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Jack was even more disappointed. He famously remarked, "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years." His superiors weren't sure if he was joking. After the war, Jack Churchill remained in the British Army, serving in Palestine during the Mandate period and later in administrative positions. But his heart wasn't in it. Peacetime military service bored him as much in the 1940s as it had in the 1930s. He needed adventure, challenge, danger. He found it in unlikely places. He became a world-class surfing enthusiast, one of the first Britons to take up the sport seriously, riding waves off the coast of Devon well into his 60s. He worked as an instructor at land-sea warfare training centers, teaching survival skills to new generations of commandos. He appeared on television occasionally, demonstrating archery and telling carefully edited versions of his war stories. He never stopped carrying his broadsword. Until the day he died in 1996, at age 89, Jack Churchill kept his grandfather's claymore in his home, oiled and maintained, ready for use. He would occasionally take it to veteran gatherings where younger soldiers would ask to see the famous sword, and Jack would draw it with a flourish and launch into stories about the war. Most of the younger soldiers thought he was embellishing. Most were wrong. The legacy. John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill died on March 8, 1996, in Surrey, England, at age 89. His obituary in the Telegraph described him as an officer and a gentleman of a type that is now extinct. The Times called him the last true warrior of Britain. His combat record is extraordinary by any measure. He participated in multiple commando raids, killed enemy soldiers with a longbow, captured prisoners with a sword, escaped from a maximum security POW camp, and survived the entire war without serious injury, despite leading from the front in every engagement. His tactics were unorthodox to the point of insanity, yet they worked consistently. Modern military historians debate whether Jack Churchill's methods were brilliant adaptation to commando warfare or simply the result of extraordinary luck combined with personal courage. The truth is probably both. Jack understood that in special operations, psychological factors often matter more than firepower. A small unit that acts with complete confidence, led by a commander who seems immune to fear, can defeat much larger forces through sheer audacity. His use of medieval weapons wasn't just eccentricity, though it was certainly that. It was psychological warfare executed on an individual level. German soldiers, trained to fight a modern mechanized war, were completely unprepared for a man charging at them with a sword while playing bagpipes. The cognitive dissonance broke their decision-making processes, creating crucial seconds of hesitation that Jack and his men exploited ruthlessly. The sword and bow also served another purpose. They made Jack memorable. In a war with millions of soldiers, he stood out. His men remembered him, respected him, followed him into situations that rationally should have been suicidal.
German soldiers who encountered him and survived told stories about the mad British officer with the sword, stories that spread fear and uncertainty. One man, using weapons from 3 different centuries, created a legend that affected enemy morale far beyond his actual combat effectiveness. The final truth. The final truth about Mad Jack Churchill is that he fought World War II the way he wanted to fight it, on his own terms, using his own methods. In a war that increasingly became about industrial production, logistics, and mass firepower, Jack insisted that individual courage, skill, and audacity still mattered, and he proved it repeatedly against the most professional military in the world. He also demonstrated something else, that warfare, for all its technology and complexity, remains fundamentally human. Soldiers don't fight for abstract ideals or strategic objectives. They fight for their comrades. They fight because they're led by commanders they trust, and they fight because someone inspires them to overcome their natural fear of death. Jack Churchill inspired his men not through speeches or ideology, but through example. When he walked onto a beach under machine gun fire playing bagpipes, when he charged enemy positions with a medieval sword, when he stood alone against overwhelming odds to buy his men time to escape, he was showing them that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the willingness to act despite fear. Modern special operations forces still study Jack Churchill's tactics, not because they're going to charge into battle with swords, but because his underlying principles remain valid. Create confusion, act decisively, lead from the front, use psychological factors as weapons, and never, ever let the enemy see you hesitate. The last knight died in 1996, but his legacy lives in every special operations soldier who leads from the front, who takes calculated risks, who understands that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the most advanced, but the most unexpected. Mad Jack Churchill proved that one man, properly armed with courage and imagination, can still change the course of battles in an age of mechanized warfare. He proved that honor, personal bravery, and sheer audacity aren't obsolete values, no matter how advanced military technology becomes. And he proved that going into combat improperly dressed, without one's sword, is simply unacceptable for a British officer. Rest in peace, Mad Jack. The world will never see your like again.